I want to thank our attendees for joining our webinar series, and we will begin in just 1 minute. Thank you. Again, a big welcome to all of our attendees here for our Rescue webinar series, a continuation of something we do once a quarter. We want to thank you for your participation. We know your time is very valuable. We hope that you find these sessions insightful. We try to provide fresh and current and very relevant information relative to disaster recovery and business continuity. The continuity lessons learned today from a practitioner's perspective is actually going to be delivered by our Director of Continuity Consulting, a fellow named Ben Thornton. I've had the pleasure of working with Ben for the last, I can't believe it, the last 21 years. Back in 1992, after Hurricane Andrew, that's when I began working with Ben and his team. And of course, that same year, there was the flooding in downtown Chicago. And you fast forward the calendar to 2012, last October, you had Superstorm Sandy and all of those disasters in between. And obviously, with what's happened up in the Midwest just recently this week, our hearts go out to the folks that were impacted by those terrible tornadoes, those that are still digging out from those events earlier this week. So again, if you look at all the points in between from 92 to today, you had 9/11, obviously Hurricane Katrina, and a week later Hurricane Rita. And then up to the events, as I mentioned earlier this week. So we've got some great information. I think you're going to find it, again, very insightful. If you think about what we do here at Rescue, just again, our focus is really in 3 areas. It's on systems, data, and people. And we've worked with small to very large organizations, and many that have had some pretty big hurdles to overcome, very interesting business challenges to overcome, and developing plans just based in some situations on the size of the organization and how spread out geographically they may be. Even fighting the wildfire situation a few years back outside of Colorado Springs, we had a customer that had call center concerns where the fire really creeped up almost to their facility, but actually they had to vacate their facility. So hopefully you're going to learn a lot from actual events that Ben and his team have had to overcome and work through, and work with organizations to build some complex business continuity and disaster recovery plans. So I'd like to turn it over to Ben Thornton. Ben, I look forward to your discussion with our attendees today.
Hey, thanks, Steve. I've been looking forward to this as well. As we were preparing this series on lessons learned, I just, in contemplating what information should we share with the group on that topic, I couldn't help but be drawn back to one of my favorite books to get a quotation that I'll use to launch this. My wife is a longtime preschool teacher, preschool director, and one of the books that she always reads to the children, I'm sure many of you will recognize, but Dr. Seuss. And he has this wonderful line. It says, "Oh, the places you will go and all the sights that you will see." As Steve mentioned, I've had the good pleasure of being involved in this wonderful business continuity industry over 20 years now, leading consulting organizations. Some I've had the pleasure of building from scratch. I've also had the pleasure of managing large national and international organizations. Over the course of that, I've had the opportunity to work with many, and I would even say hundreds of customers. And so as I was preparing this presentation, the first thought on my mind is, what is the greatest concern that I come across in talking to prospective clients? And that really boils down to one word, and that's complacency. It's not going to happen to me. And that's the point that I wanted to start with, is to talk about that just a little bit. A good friend of mine said a couple of years ago, made a comment to me, you know what, bad things happen to perfectly good buildings. And that resonated with me, because I began to think about some of the clients that I had worked with over the years, and what happened to them. And indeed, those clients had perfectly good buildings, but for one reason or another, they were not able to engage in that building, use that building for the purpose that it was intended. So I've listed a couple of them here. I thought it might be of some interest to the group. Let's start by talking a little bit about some examples. What can go wrong? What can go wrong? Well, the first one I've labeled fire in the hole. This occurred with a client some years back. They were located in San Francisco, down in the Embarcadero area there. And it was kind of interesting as they described this to me. The group had gone out to lunch. This is a multi-tenant building. The IT department, in other words, the data center, was also located there in that same building. Well, a group of them went out to lunch one day. And as they went outside, they began to notice a lot of commotion in the street. Didn't think too much about it, but so they went on and had lunch. While later they came back, and as they got close to the building, they realized that they were not going to be allowed entrance into the building. In fact, the fire department had put up tape around the building. They did not allow anybody into the building. And yet you looked at the building, it was in perfectly good shape. And so what was the problem? Well, you know, most disasters start very simply, and then, as Murphy says, over time get worse. And that was exactly what happened here. So what was happening in the street? Well, the telephone company was out working in a manhole in front of the street. And at that time, there was still a lot of cable in that manhole that was lead cable. Now, that means the sheath of the cable was lead, and if the sheath is lead, then the splice box has to be lead, and that was what was going on here. The gentleman was there doing some splicing and had used the blowtorch to open the splice box and had done his work and was starting to reseal that when he inadvertently ignited one of the adjacent cables that was the newer material. And so before he knew it, he had a pretty good size fire or burning in that manhole, and a lot of smoke coming up. One thing led to another. From the manhole, there were pipes then from that ductwork from that manhole into the various buildings around there, including my client's building. Those are normally plugged on the inside, so that if they don't have cable in them, they're plugged in some way anyway. But reason being, the manhole's filled with water. You don't want that flowing into the building. Well, in this case, there were some ducts that were not plugged. That smoke then was billowing into the basement of that building. There it was picked up very effectively by the nearby air conditioning circulation and distributed throughout the building. So we had a perfectly good building that was thoroughly filled with smoke now, and you think that's not that bad a deal. We just flush the smoke out and we should be good to go. But then it gets worse. Remember the cable that was on fire. What was burning there was PC contaminant that requires some special cleaning. So the fire department shut the building down. It was a couple of weeks before they were able to get back in and operate in that building. So again, perfectly good building, something bad had happened to it. And you think, it's not going to happen to me. Well, it did to them that day. Another time I was working with a company in Austin, Texas, and we would go out to lunch each day, and as we were driving out, as we were returning, I kept seeing a building there that was boarded up, and it looked like a brand new building. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I had to ask, what's going on here? How come that building's boarded up? It looks like it's brand new. And they began to tell me the story that indeed the people had occupied the building, and in a very short period of time they began noticing that people were getting sick. There was a real problem there. And when they investigated it further, they found that the problem was they had not sealed the building well during the construction process, and it was become laden with radon gas. And so they had to evacuate the building. It was a perfectly good building, but something bad had happened to it. The interesting thing about that is most government buildings, you put there's a sign usually imprinted into the stone above the main entrance that defines what occupies the building. And so I couldn't help but laugh as I looked at that, and of course the name of this building was the Texas Air Quality Commission. You can't make this stuff up, folks. That was exactly what happened. Got another one I called Fire on the Mountain. This happened a year and a half ago. A client we were working with located out in Colorado Springs. If you remember, there were a lot of forest fires in the Colorado mountains, not this past summer, but the previous one. And they had encountered a fire. The fire was really raging over to the west of their property. They were located up in the Garden of the Gods area. If you're familiar with that at all, you know that that slopes right up to the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. So the fire was off to the west. Didn't think that much about it until a very intense thunderstorm developed over there. And you think, thunderstorm, that should put the fire out. Well, good theory, but it didn't work that way in practice. The storm created a lot of wind, and that wind came up the slope, blew the fire over onto the eastern slope and down that slope. It ended up stopping about 20 feet from our client's parking lot, where it did, in fact, pretty effectively melt some of the asphalt in that. And also, it was about 20 feet away from the diesel tanks for the generators. So they ended up closing that building, evacuating the entire area that that building was in, and they were displaced for about 4 days. Again, perfectly good building. The building itself was not destroyed, but it was closed. They were not able to occupy that, and therefore they had to abandon a very large call center that was in that building. Hurricanes, another example, the Hurricane Sandy in New York City, working with a client up there. This one is noteworthy because some of the internal politics with our client was a large company that was headquartered actually in Chicago, but had a major division in the New York City area, in fact, right down by New York Harbor. As Hurricane Sandy came in, they were anticipating what they might need to do. The local people began taking measures, sending people home and so forth, but then after the storm passed, the issue became one of coordination and communication. The people in Chicago were trying to call the shots on whether they needed to allow people to return to the office or not. The people on the ground in New York saw exactly what was going on. They knew what they needed to do there, but they were overridden continually by the people in Chicago. So again, a perfectly good building. As it turned out, they could have occupied it, but because of decisions being made elsewhere, they were not able to do that. Another hurricane was a client down in New Orleans in the Metairie area, and they had a recovery strategy that would have their people, the critical people, relocate to Baton Rouge in the event of a hurricane coming in. And what actually happened last year was, as a hurricane approached New Orleans, not this past summer, the previous summer, they began to implement the plan, and Mother Nature has a way of playing tricks on you. What actually happened, the hurricane veered off to the west and actually sliced between New Orleans on the outskirts of Metairie and Baton Rouge. And so what they found was that the well-laid plans did not account for the escape route that they need to get from New Orleans into the Baton Rouge recovery location. So we learned a dear lesson there as far as timing as those hurricanes are coming ashore. Another one was military activation. That's one we don't worry about too much here in the United States, but we happen to be working with a client in Israel. I just bring it up because I think it makes a lot of points that could be very germane to us as we're planning here in the United States as well. In Israel, one of the major issues there is the population has a military obligation for men. That is, they're obligated to be in the Army Reserve, and they're therefore subject to activation up until age 45, unless they can get some waiver on that. For women, it's age 35. This was a young company we were working with, had quite a few people that were in that age bracket where they were members of the military. And the issue that we were dealing with there was not one of the building being destroyed, but what happens in the event that one of their neighboring countries creates a situation that requires activation of the military, and therefore extraction of people that normally be working in the business. And so, again, a perfectly good building, but for because of events that would be happening external to that building, indeed possibly even external to the country, they could be in a dire jeopardy as far as being able to continue operation of the company. So it became an issue of identifying who are those critical people, how can we achieve cross-training so that we had people that could step into the breach, if you will, if those people were activated. And I'll leave one more as well, as the issue of resiliency versus recovery. Working with a client that had a major data center, about 75,000 square feet, had done a wonderful job as far as building resiliency into their operation. They had set the building up, the data center up into 4 quadrants, and systems that were in quadrant A, for example, were designed to be failover into their like systems in quadrant D, and therefore C and B were the same thing. I think you understand what I'm saying. Great job there. But what they had failed to do was protect in the event they lost the entire building. So they had absolutely no recoverability that was built into this design. It was all self-contained in one building. Not a very good design at all, and so we had a great opportunity to work with them and bring in the concept of recovery in the event they lost that entire building. So I think that kind of sets the story then for what we want to talk about today. So what have we learned? These are examples. Complacency, I'm just still concerned that so many people think it literally can't happen to me, it can't happen to us, and they're not taking the steps that are needed. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean complete and utter destruction of a building. So how do we define a disaster? Well, before that, why do we even plan? Let's ask the bigger question. And I think a great answer to that is contained in this quote that I came across some years ago in Tom Clancy's book, Debt of Honor. You can see it on the screen, but let me read that for you. Of all human lamentations, without a doubt, the most common is, if I had only known. He goes on to say, but we can't know, and so days of death and fire so often begin no differently than those of love and war. Boy, that hits right to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? It makes the statement, we can't know what tomorrow will bring. Indeed, we can't know what this afternoon will bring. And so we have to plan. We have to be prepared. We must take the steps that are necessary. So how do we define a disaster? I ask that question when I'm doing speeches around the country. If I'm on the West Coast, invariably when I ask that question, somebody's going to bring up a earthquake. If I'm in the Florida along the seaboard, somebody's going to bring up hurricane. If I'm in the Midwest, they're going to be talking about tornadoes. And then most recently working with a client that had offices, good-sized offices, up in various territories within Canada, and they're worried about snowfall. So how does this whole thing, what does disaster really, really mean? Well, we use a definition that I think really speaks to the heart of that. It really doesn't matter what the event is. The disaster needs to be defined from the standpoint of what's the effect on the business. And so we use the definition, any condition that prevents me from performing my critical business functions within an acceptable period of time. That makes a disaster from a business perspective. So we're focusing not on what caused the situation, but what's the effect of the situation on the business. Two things are identified there, what's critical and what's an acceptable period of time. Well, how do we go about answering that question? What are those two things? That's what we're going to talk about a little bit more this afternoon's presentation. So, what are the basics? We need first to have a plan. We need to have a plan. There are a number of plans, and I've kind of listed some of them here. Maybe we've got a building evacuation plan. Hopefully your building where you're located has that. If it doesn't, I highly recommend that you develop one. How do you notify people that something's going on and they need to get out of the building? And if they need to get out of the building, how can you do that the most effectively so that you can coordinate and control that process? Most cities require testing of those plans, but I'm finding that more and more either do not require it or do not enforce that. So if you're in a multi-tenant building, for example, your property owner should be working with you to test not just you, but the other tenants in that building to test their plan. And you need to be sure that you understand what their plan is and what their expectations are for you, and therefore what your expectations should be for them. So building evacuation is extremely important. Crisis management. How do we deal with a situation such as a shooter in the lobby? Boy, we're seeing more and more of those situations in today's environment. Or a bomb threat, or maybe anthrax was the hot item several years ago. How do you deal with those things? What are the proper instructions that we should give? How do we prepare for those so that when something happens, we're ready to respond to it? That's not going to create a disaster necessarily, but it certainly is going to create a disruption to the business, so we need to be prepared for that. Business operations themselves, that's what we typically, when we're talking about business continuity planning, that's what we're talking about. And that has to do with the logistics of how the business operates. What are the critical business functions that are performed? How would we be able to recover those? We need to have a plan for dealing with our technology. That's what we call our disaster recovery plan. That's the one that most people are familiar with. That's the thing that's been around the longest in our industry. But business operation, recovery of that, continuation of that, that's obviously a very prevailing issue as well. So the first and foremost, as a minimum, we need to be sure that we've got these plans that are put together so that we can deal with events that come up and also the effect of those events on the business. How do you go about doing that? Well, what I've got up here right now is a very straightforward methodology that we have used effectively. We're glad to share that with others. It's a process. So many times clients will call us up and say, do you guys develop disaster recovery plans or business continuity plans? Well, the answer to that is yes. But then they say, come develop one, help us develop one. Well, that's not where you start. It's a process. We first have to understand what are recovery requirements, and perhaps, hopefully you've heard the term business impact analysis, or BIA. That's the purpose of that type of a study, is to determine what are the recovery requirements, whether I'm dealing with an IT recovery capability or a business operation itself. So a business impact analysis is an excellent way to get your hands around those requirements. Couple that with a risk assessment that can be done at the same time. You do that and you're well on your way. Those requirements then, once they're understood, now you're prepared, you're in a situation where you can start to look at what recovery strategy would need if to meet those requirements. We call that, in our business, a recovery option study, where we look at that. We first determine requirements, and then we look at, so how can we, that determines the problem, so how can we solve the problem? That's our strategies. And that's what that study is intended to do. Now I am finally ready to build some plans. The reason we're doing it that way, I can't really build an effective plan without understanding my requirements. I can't build an effective plan without understanding the strategy that has been selected and is funded, so that we now have a strong basis for the content of those plans. Once we have those two elements, then plan development becomes very straightforward. Another concept that's coming into play here is about really achieving balance. Maybe you've seen some variation of this graph that's on the screen now. So the first thing, the BIA, that determines, gives us a feel for what's the effect on the business on day one, on day two, on week one, and so forth. What does that look like from the standpoint of business impacts? And here I'm showing you might have some functions that are very critical, and so you see a very steep slope. You may have some other functions that aren't that critical, and so therefore, and that's shown as option B, therefore that could take longer before you had to worry about recovering that. So that gives us one side of the equation. What's the problem? Let's look at the other side of the equation. How can we solve the problem? Very typically, the sooner you need to be able to recover, the cost of that preparing for that solution is much higher than if you can wait for a period of time. In this case, 7 days or longer. So we're seeing a curve here, and these are illustrative. Please understand that. So how does this whole thing fit together? Well, first, by establishing what is the impact on the business, now you can have a discussion with the executive group as to how much impact they're willing to accept as a risk. That's what you see on the dotted line that's horizontal on that left curve. And so we have a point of discussion now. How effective do they need? What time period do they need to have this plan to be able to kick into place? And in essence, what we're saying, if you follow that, so on that option A curve, it goes up, it intersects with that dotted line. We're saying that we can afford to have an impact that would get that bad, relatively speaking, and then that's as bad as it goes. Our strategy needs to be one that would kick in at that point and keep it from getting any worse. Take that, so roughly you can see that's about the end of the first day in that option A. You come over to the right side, that says that if we're going to look at the 1 day time period, the vertical dotted line there shows us that we're talking about a relatively expensive solution to be able to do that, versus option B, it's much further out, somewhere around day 5 or 6, and see it's a much lower cost to be able to prepare for that. So these are concepts. These are things that we need to bear in mind as we're doing this type of a project, but this is critical if we're going to have a good, meaningful discussion with the executive team as far as what's the issue and how can we solve the problem? What are the trade-offs, in other words? Well, how do you go about doing that? The devil's in the details, as it said here. The first part of that slide gives us what I call a target recovery time objective, whether it's the applications or the business functions. So it's a target recovery time objective, and here's where I differentiate a little bit with, differ with the Disaster Recovery Institute, for example. I think they're still teaching that that would be your RTO. It's not. It's a target RTO. Why do I say that? Because you haven't yet got funding for a solution that will allow you to meet that. But it is a starting place. That's where you're going to start looking. What do we need to do next? Well, the application, I'm going to stay with the IT side because it's very straightforward. The applications need to be mapped to the servers. That's the next step in the process. That will help determine what is our minimum configuration, which we need to determine, and that is from the standpoint of what infrastructure is required, what servers, other equipment, what data management techniques are we going to use or require, and so forth. So when we've got that minimum configuration, then you can look at different solutions or different options, and notice there is a bold and underlined S at the end of options. One thing that I've seen repeatedly is when we're trying to get approval to implement a disaster recovery strategy, so many times the tack is taken that says, I'm going to figure out what's the best idea, I'm going to document that, and then I'm going to present it to the executive group and say, here's the problem, here's what we need to do about it, and here's how much it costs, please fund the deal. And then it seems to surprise people that the executives reject that and say, no, I need more information. I was having a conversation just this week with a prospective client on that very issue. That's exactly what they had done, and believe it or not, they were shocked that the executives didn't just buy in right away. They wanted to see more detail. So when you're developing those options, you've got to identify the associated costs. You've got to be able to talk about the benefits that those options provide. They're all technically viable. They just offer different capabilities and at different price points. If we can provide that information in that type of manner, talk about it good and concisely with the executive group, then they can make a decision and decide what they do want to do. At the end of the day, this whole process is about obtaining that executive concurrence, and part of that, obtaining the funding that's necessary. One thing I've also learned over the years, it's a lot easier to get funding approved when you're talking about a specific project as opposed to trying to solve an operational need. And so oftentimes when we're talking about, and disaster recovery certainly falls into that, if we're talking about a disaster recovery project, we can generally incorporate and resolve some operational needs as part of that project. So that's a very important point I think we should keep in mind as well. So we've talked about plans a good bit. What does the plan look like? What are the characteristics that it should have? And I've highlighted those that I think are the most important here. First and foremost, obviously, it goes pretty simple, but they should be executable. I've seen so many people that wanted to develop plans just to simply put on the shelf so that we could pass an audit. I classify those as administrative plans. They're not built on a solid foundation of requirements, recovery strategy, and a funded strategy moving forward. And so if you're going to go to the trouble of developing the plans, you certainly ought to make sure that it's executable. Time phasing. This loops back to the definition that we use for disaster. Time phasing. What is critical? What's an acceptable period of time? Once those things have been identified and the solution bought into, now we've established a recovery time objective, and we should be able to point our recovery plan to that meeting that recovery time objective. The only way to do that is to time phase it. What do I need to do first? What's most critical? How fast do I need to get it done? What's next? Who's doing that? Those types of things. The plan needs to be action-oriented. And again, I've seen so many plans that have been developed as almost as fireside reading, as a text material. You've got to read through a lot of information before you ever get to something that's executable. We've learned that it's far more desirable to make a plan more bullet approach, taking a bullet approach. Do this, then do this, then do this. It's an action-oriented plan. Extremely important. Along that same line, keep it simple. Keep it so that it's clearly understood. Don't start trying to use terms and terminology and wording phrases that are not something that you use regularly in your business. Use the same terms that you normally refer to. Make sure that the departments that you're working with or the groups you're working with, that they're using terms that their people could understand, or just as importantly, if they were not available, someone else could pick up that plan and understand what it's talking about. The plan needs to address multiple scenarios. Now, if you really think about that, what are the most likely scenarios? Staying with the definition that we used, inability to perform critical business functions within an acceptable period of time, you really stop and think there are two primary scenarios that would cover probably 95% of the circumstances you could find yourself in that's caused a disaster. Very straightforward, that is loss of IT support. So the data center's down. The data center cannot operate for some reason. That's one scenario. The second scenario is inability to occupy and therefore use the facility itself, the building that you operate in. There are a lot of things that can cause events that can cause those two scenarios, but at the end of the day, I can't get into the building or I can't get access to IT. If you can build a plan based on those, you've covered probably somewhere in that 90 to 95% of the events that you're likely to be dealing with. Later on, you can come back, add some additional scenarios. So maybe a pandemic situation, which was a really big issue a couple of years ago. We haven't had that occurrence of some of those exposures lately, but they can certainly come back. So it's not a bad idea to incorporate that into the plan. But I certainly would not recommend, if you don't have anything today, I would recommend you want to get that good 90-95% coverage by attacking those two scenarios. That's kind of along the principle of crawl, walk, and run. If you don't have anything today, you're probably in a crawling situation. Get the 90-95% covered. Then you're in a walking situation, which is good. Add on to it those other scenarios and begin to refine the plan until finally, as you're doing more and more testing, you're getting better at it. Now you're up and running. The other characteristic is maintainability. If you've simplified by making it action-oriented, if it's time-phased, if it's simple and clearly easy to understand, and if it's built on those scenarios, the plan itself needs to be thinking through as you construct it, the content, that needs to be in a way that's easy to maintain. The building blocks for a business continuity plan, for example, are the business functions. They're not the departments. You might build a departmental plan that has functions in it and then find out that less than a year later you've reorganized, those functions are now performed in another department. So we need to have an ability to extract the information relative to that function, move it into the new department's plan, and just insert it there. That can be done, but it can't. It needs to be thought about and thought out in advance as you're building the plans. So I think those are the key characteristics of what I look for in a plan to make sure that it's good, it's solvable, it's executable. Beyond that, though, what else do we need to be thinking about? Well, process interdependencies. You see some of these listed here. Critical staffing. I talked about that with that company in Israel, but it doesn't have to be that unique. We find repeatedly that there are people in any organization that become in and of themselves a single point of failure. And when we identify that, then we have to think about, so how can we correct that? And usually that's through some type of cross-training or assigning other people some different responsibilities so that they begin to acquire those skills that are necessary. Critical vendors, I've listed those because think about this situation for just a moment. So let's say if we've lost our building, we can't occupy it. We've got several hundred people that maybe we have to have operational within a 1-week period or a 2-week period. The IT staff that you have today, that staff is not sized, it's not prepared, it's not ready to do that level of work. They are sized, they're ready to do maintenance or individual problem resolution, those types of things, but not to build out a corporate environment that would seat that number of people. So you need to think, so what critical vendors do I need to make arrangements with that would be able to come in and help me in that situation? That's just one example. I listed single points of failure because I often ask the question, what's the easiest disaster to recover from? And if you think about that, the answer is a disaster that never happened. And so if we can identify single points of failure, if we can mitigate those single points of failure, remove them from the equation, or it certainly lower the probability they're going to take place, then we've probably avoided a disaster, or at least we've gone a long way toward avoiding a disaster. So when we're doing a project, we're always looking for single points of failure. Those are things we want to loop back with and deal with as far as eliminating. Kind of along that same thing with risk mitigation. Once we understand risk, then we can talk about how to reduce that risk. And of course, regional issues. It's one thing to start in with a plan that's built in case I lose the building, but what if that situation is much larger than just your building? What if the entire region's affected? How am I going to deal with that? Well, that's another one of those. As I'm progressing up from crawl to walk to run, I want to be dealing with regional issues. But I've seen so many people that get bogged down worrying so much about that that they don't get anything done. Let's make this thing a very straightforward process. Let's deal with the facility we're in. Later we'll come back and deal with that regional issue. Another characteristic of the plan is certainly to keep it current. And you got to ask yourself, what changes? What can change? Well, I've already talked about an organizational change. Processes can change. We might be in a process, or you might be in a process where you're mechanizing, if you will, a process. You're beginning to use technology to enhance what people are doing, or maybe even replace whole organizations or functions. Well, if that's the case, then we need to be able to adjust the plans to accommodate that. There may be new applications that are coming along, new technology that's being employed, and so forth. Some of the key assumptions may have changed. For example, dealing with a company not that long ago, they had some pretty good plans that they had put together some years ago when they were a small company. But guess what? They had grown up. They were now a truly a national company, and they had prospects of moving into an international environment. Their world had gotten a lot more complex, and yet those plans had never been maintained. And so they had an issue there. We had to update, significant update to those plans. We had to rethink basic assumptions and so forth. So keeping a plan current, extremely important. So I get the question all the time, how frequently should we update the plans? My answer to that is a resounding, it depends. It depends on how the type of change that takes place in your environment. It depends on special circumstances. Has the company recently acquired another division or company that would become a new division? Then that might drive the need to go in and update all the plans based on that. So a lot of things can contribute to plans changing, and that's going to have an effect on how frequently plans need to be updated. I would say as an absolute minimum, they ought to be looked at annually on a scheduled way, and I'm working with several companies right now doing that exact thing, where we go in on an annual basis and we do a major overhaul of their plans to make sure we understand what changes have occurred during this past year, and then we reflect that into the plan. If you're in a more volatile environment, you might need to do that semi-annually. Not too many people need to do it quarterly that I've found, but think about that. It depends a lot on what's going on within your business. And then finally, if you're talking about a plan, an untested plan is not considered to be an executable plan. If you haven't tested it, if you haven't validated the information that's in there, the processes that are in there, the procedures that are in there, the technology that is assumed to be in place, then it's probably not an executable plan. So why do we test? Well, as it says here, it increases the likelihood of good decisions being made under pressure. The last thing you want to do is take an untested plan and try and use it at that point in time where your business is at its most critical exposure in its history. You need to test. Different types of testing. And that is, of course, as we've listed it here. IT testing, we talk about that a good bit. But we need to test procedures, whether it's in the IT plan or the procedures that are part of the business continuity plan. Are the timelines correct? If the timelines are right, if the action items we've identified can be performed within the time period that we've allotted for them and in the sequence, then you can take that timeline and it will show you the critical path that will produce your RTO. And so we need to validate that. I used to lead the national business continuity practice for SunGuard, based here, and at that time I was based here in Atlanta, and go over to the recovery facility that we had here. I love to go over and watch and talk to people that were there testing. And I would just roam around chatting with them, and I would always ask the question, how's your test going? Probably 98% of the time I would get a response, oh, it's going great. Then I would ask the next question, how do you know? And I'd get that deer in the headlights look. When we talked about it further, invariably we would find out that they were testing recovery of an application, and I asked them, what did you do last year? Well, it was testing recovery of this same application. How about the year before? Same answer. They didn't come with an idea of validating the information they had in their plan. They were simply there to see if they could bring up an application. Not could they bring it up within the time period and within the action steps that they had identified. And how about those action steps? Were the time estimates on those incrementally? Were those accurate? There's a lot more to testing than just going and doing a physical test. It's laying out a process that's going to allow us to validate the whole process. Can we perform it here in this environment so that we know we can perform it at the most critical time that we have to perform it? I also get a lot of questions about how frequent should we test. And again, I answer that with a resounding, it depends. It depends on what's going on in your environment. It depends on your maturity level in doing your testing program. It depends on a lot of things. Point is, test, test, test. An untested plan is a plan for disaster itself. I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about what's going on within the industry, what's changing. And I think the watchword there is the expectations. Preparedness is no longer an option. Why do I say that? We're finding executive boards all over the country are really getting into asking the tough question, where are we with our business continuity plans? Where are we with our disaster recovery plans? Have we tested those? First, do we have them? Second, have we tested them? Executives are asking the question as well because they know the boards are going to be asking that of them. Market demand is something that is really driving this as well. We're finding stakeholders asking that question. We're finding a lot of clients are getting questions from their vendors. Are you prepared to support me when I'm dealing with a disaster? Great question. You should be asking the very same question of your critical vendors or those that you rely upon. Technology itself is changing dramatically, and that's having huge implications for business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. For example, it wasn't that many years ago, we really, there was a huge investment that was required in some of the companies that really specialize in a shared recovery services. They've sunk a lot of money into buildings, a lot of money into equipment, and now we're finding as technology is changing, the footprints are reducing, IP technology is coming along, cloud computing, that's the buzzword, the marketing word now, and suddenly all of that preparation is no longer valid in today's environment, and they're really struggling to keep up. And then more and more, we're seeing a desire and a requirement for integrated planning and integrated exercises or tests, which we highly applaud here. We think that's really the way to go. So if I'm going to do a disaster recovery test of my IT infrastructure, doesn't it make a lot of sense to engage some of the business units that will be using those systems and let them participate? Or as they're doing their business continuity testing, not a bad idea to integrate some of the IT capabilities into that test so that we really start to get an integrated feel for how well these things could really work together in the event that they were really needed in dealing with a disaster. So day of disaster, we know that it'll work. Well, that's, I think, pretty exhaustive, I hope, tour through the whole issue about lessons learned. What needs to be in a plan? What should the plan look like? How do you go about doing it? We've touched on that. We can drill deeper into that in later, maybe a different later webinar. But we sure wanted to give you some benefits from what we've been seeing here over the last 20 years as this industry has evolved and matured. So I'm going to stop there. We've got some questions that have come in. We'll take just a couple of minutes to answer a couple of those. We'll get to what we can. And Steve, you've got those?
I do, and we want to thank again our listeners, all those who participated and have continued to participate in our Rescue webinar series. Again, we hope you find this information helpful for you to continue to grow and build your program. And if you have any ideas or suggestions for further topics, we do this once a quarter, please email those. Our email address is listed not only on the invite but the actual slide deck itself. We have gotten a number of requests for the slide deck, which we will provide a PDF version of the deck that Ben walked you through this afternoon. We do have a little bit of time left. We like to keep on task with the allotted time, which was from 2 to 3 Eastern. So we've got 5 minutes for some questions, and then we'll wrap things up. But again, thanks everyone, and we'll get through as many of these questions as we can. Ben, the first question I have is, what is the best way to get executive buy-in and budget for our business continuity program?
Boy, that's a great question, Steve. And, you know, it's one that comes up just about every time we do one of these webinars. How do you solve that problem? And when you read the trade materials, the disaster recovery journal documents, and so forth, that's still an issue that's at the top of the list. I think the key point there, and I touched on it a little bit in the conversation here, is don't fall into the trap of going to the executive group with just one solution in mind. If you really want to get an approval, give them options, give them cost, give them trade-offs and benefits so that you're engaging them in the process of making that decision. I just see every time I hear of someone that goes to the executive group with just one solution, just one costed out, one fully fleshed out, whatever term you want to use, fully baked solution. The executives are not, for the most part, IT professionals. They don't understand a lot of what you're talking about. And so it really shouldn't shock or surprise anybody that they say that they don't just jump all over your proposal. So that's the best thing. Remember, you're going after concurrence, you're going after consensus in what's the best thing. And to me, I think that's the greatest failure that I see.
Good, Ben. Another question is, have you come across any other designation for critical staff?
Any other designations
for critical staff?
Oh, okay. I had to read the question here itself. I think I understand it now. So the point I think that's being made in that question, it's an issue that I know we've dealt with since I got into the industry. We try to be very careful in not in any way inferring that a business process or a person is not important. So when we use definitions of priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, whatever that might be, priority 1 might be critical, priority 2 might be significant, priority 3 might be important. We never say that someone is not important. That goes back to the concern that people have about what you're really doing here is you're trying to resize the organization. You're trying to determine, if I'm not critical, then my job might be in jeopardy. That's not the message we're trying to send. So I think that's a great point that your executives are sensitive to that issue. Frankly, I always use critical because I think that has exactly the connotation that you want. It's the function that's critical. It's not the person, it's the function. And Steve, I guess that's the best input I've got on that one. I haven't really thought about that one, but we'll give that some consideration. And if I let me come up with something better, I'll certainly share that with you. So the person that submitted that, we'll try and get back to you with that.
Then another question is governance, policy, regulations is still a hot term, but from a practical and real-world approach, and more DRBCP and IT security are sharing similar area, how do you see BCM and security cohabitating? How do you see those coming together?
That's been a lot of fun to watch over the years. I've gotten a lot of similar questions about, so where does business continuity fit into the organization? And I think that might have some bearing on this question here. So where does it fit? Historically, I've seen it in a lot of different organizations. More than any other, for whatever reason, well, I think I've got an idea what the reason is, but in the CFO organization or the financial organization. That's historically. Probably resided there because those are the people that are seeing all the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements. They're having to respond to all of that. They're up close. They're personal to all of that. I've seen some companies try to adapt it into the IT organization. I don't think that's a good idea to have IT responsible for recovery of the business operation itself. So that, to me, is a big X, and I have not seen that in the last few years, but I am seeing it more and more integrated into the security or the risk management organizations. There's a maturing going on as far as the risk management officer, and that's where I'm seeing it appear more and more now. But an inherent part of that is the security aspect of it. Whether you're talking about physical security or whether you're talking about IT security, there's very close alignment certainly within disaster recovery for the IT environment. So, yeah, those things I think are going to continue to come closer and closer together. People are realizing if I'm going to my alternate site, I do have a security issue, certainly on the IT side. I need to make that an inherent part of my plan and so forth. So I think those things are going to come closer and closer together, Steve.
Ben, we've got time for one more question, and then we need to wrap things up. This person asked the question, how do you determine the number of teams that should be in our business continuity plan? Number of teams.
Okay. Well, the way that we do that is I always start with looking at an organizational chart to understand what departments are there, how large are those departments, how do they fit together, and so forth. And then from that, we probably end up developing, more times than not, we would certainly develop a plan for the major departments, a team plan for the major departments. And then we look to see, so maybe there's some others that can fit together that don't necessarily warrant a large, detailed plan, but we can integrate several functions together into an executable. Maybe that becomes a floor plan that includes several of those organizations. So different ways to look at it there, but I usually start right with that organization chart to understand the basic organization. What are the major organizations, and how do they all fit together? By the same token, I've had some clients that were very adamant that want to develop plans based on physical, just floors. What organizations are on the floor? So develop a plan for the floor, or develop a plan for this tower that includes several floors. So, there's not one correct answer. You have to look at and understand the requirements of the individual organization or company, and then go from there.
Great, Ben. Thank you. Again, I want to thank our webinar listeners for joining us today. Certainly wish you the best Thanksgiving holiday that's coming our way. And in the meantime, please be on the lookout for further webinar series from Rescue and our Rescue Services team. And at this point, we'll give you your day back and say thanks again, one and all.